Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me as we take a look at your update on Lee over the next few days and the track and any impacts on southern Vermont. I want to start off by saying right now the coast is almost clear. So headlines on this looks like the track is probably going to be east of us enough where at most we see a glancing blow here in southern Vermont, and even that might be we may just really see some clouds and some breeze. But want to keep an eye on it. I know a lot of you've been watching it. If you're in eastern New England, which I'm sure a lot of you know people in eastern New England or at least care about people in eastern New England, certainly still a concern. If you're in Nova Scotia, even more of a concern, certainly still in terms of impacts and things like that. But yeah, let's take a look at what's going on. First of all, here's Lee out here in the middle of, or sort of still just north of Puerto Rico. Hasn't really moved much recently. It's sort of stuck. We're going to show you why that is here in a minute. Lee's pressure's down around 948 millibars, winds of 115 miles an hour. It's a well-developed hurricane. It has never really re-strengthened to the extent that we thought it might. Models have not been great on the strength forecast for Lee, although it has basically maintained its strength here. Part of it at this point is it's been spinning in the Atlantic, and it hasn't really moved much in the last day and a half. And when that happens, you get upwelling. What happens is the hurricane pushes the water around so much underneath it, obviously, and is generating waves such that you start to draw up deeper ocean water. And of course, especially in this part of the world, the surface of the water is much warmer than the water underneath, and it starts to cool you water temps off a little bit. And that's partially why you see this looks more like a hurricane, kind of over slightly cooler water. Some of the structure looks a little more like a hurricane over cooler water, and probably that's because that upwelling is happening, and it's sapping a little bit of the heat energy that Lee can tap in order to generate basically to strengthen as a storm. Still very powerful Category 3 hurricane, sending huge waves up and down the East Coast. Basically big issues with rip currents and some beach erosion here across all the way from Florida all the way up to Maine. So yeah, not an ideal situation. What's going to happen here, you can see, here's our main player in terms of the direction of what's going to happen with Lee. This is a trough, which is going to approach us with some rain tomorrow. And as this approaches, Lee is going to start to move basically north, or pretty much due north actually, from where it is now. Now, normally if a hurricane turns and goes north from where Lee is now, we are completely in the clear. The only place you'd have to really worry about would be Bermuda, and Bermuda will probably take a glancing blow, but it'll be just to the west of Bermuda in terms of the central core. So Bermuda looks to take kind of a glancing blow from Lee. After that, though, what might happen? Here's where the fly in the ointment comes. The trough may basically lift and will pretty much lift out just north of Lee and not really capture it and turn it off to the north and east, which happens a lot of times, but intended to sort of slide over the top of it. The question is, at how much does it slide over the top of it? And the American model, the GFS, and the European model disagree a little bit about it, and they've also gone back and forth on this. They've both kind of showed both of these two scenarios, which I'm going to show you right now. Over the overnight runs last night, the ECMWF had the more western track, and the GFS had the more eastern track. Yesterday they were sort of flipped, kind of showing you that both are still a possibility, and it has mostly to do with how quickly Lee moves north. So let's take a look. First of all, here's the National Hurricane Track. This is kind of, and the National Hurricane Service does a good job of giving basically the reasonable realm of opportunities, right? So right now, they would project landfall just east of Maine, over the western tip of Nova Scotia, and probably tropical storm strength at that point, which would still have impacts, but obviously not 115 mile an hour Category 3 hurricane kind of impacts. Now you can see the cone of uncertainty here that goes all the way from on a very western part of that of the track, the Cape and the Cape Cod and all of the Maine coast would be involved in that. And if we took a western part of that track, we wouldn't see major impacts, but rain could start to become a problem for us, and we would see some pretty significant impacts potentially out of Lee. Certainly, if it took the eastern part of that track, we're not even going to see clouds hardly. If it takes the kind of down the middle track, then we're probably going to see just basically some cloudiness, maybe a sprinkle or two on the very outer edges of the storm, and some kind of breezy winds out of the north and northeast for us. So that's sort of the realm of possibilities. It would have to go even left of the projected track, which is pretty unlikely at this point. West of the projected track, even the cone, for us to get into kind of really significant issues. That's why I say we're almost in the clear. Under an even worse case scenario at this point, I think we don't see kind of significant. We see some impacts, significant impacts maybe, but not horrendous impacts or anything like that. So here's a look at the upper level wind basically that's going on across the Atlantic now, the northern Atlantic now. And what you can see is there's this trough over the top of Lee, and you can see it's kind of stuck here. There's the winds. If you look at the upper level winds, you can see that basically there's not much wind movement here anywhere around Lee, which is why Lee is pretty much stalled out. To the west, obviously, we have these southwesterly winds associated with this trough. The yellow kind of shows where there's more energy in the atmosphere, and you can just certainly also kind of showing where some of that wind, that jet stream, is associated with the trough here at the mid levels of the atmosphere. And so this, like I said, if we go ahead one more step and go to, this is going to be Thursday evening. Whoops, let me put myself in the view here. We can see how we're starting to get some differences. But the overall part of the pattern that you're going to see is the trough starts to envelop Lee here a bit, although it's going to the north. So on our left, we have what the American model thinks is going to happen. And on the right, we have what the European model thinks is going to happen. And essentially, you can see that the trough is a little bit stronger modeled in the American model right now than it is on the European model. And because of that, it's drawing Lee a little bit quicker towards itself and going to capture Lee just a little bit more. We'll see that on the next model run, because basically Lee is heading pretty much due north at this point. And it's a little subtle to see here, but the European model has Lee south and east, basically. Basically, it's just a slower moving storm at this point. It's not being captured quite as much. And what's going to happen is on the European model, the trough swings out to the north of Lee, and that allows Lee to kind of jog back to the west, because the next steering current would be this ridge. And the ridge will want to turn Lee potentially back towards New England a little bit, enough that it starts to give significant impacts to southern New England, whereas the American model right now wants to get drawn into the trough and kind of go due north and then eventually east, but would still make landfall. Like I said, kind of that's the Nova Scotia landfall model. The ECMWF, the European model, is the main, and maybe even potentially in a worst case scenario, Cape Cod kind of landfall here. In this scenario, you certainly could get a hurricane landfall. This is probably a tropical storm strength storm. This would be a minimal hurricane, weak hurricane, but still hurricane probably if it came on shore across the Cape. Would be a significant storm. So that's sort of your two scenarios that are potentially happening right now. Subtle differences that make the difference, and the models are not locked in on either one of these. Again, this looked basically flipped yesterday, same kind of scenario, but flipped yesterday. Both models have shown this. The other major global models, the Canadian model has shown this westward jog potential as well. It's certainly been there in the ensemble models, which just run the models many, many times and give you different track potentials. There has been basically it's not determined yet, and not really determinable yet, because it's a pretty subtle difference. Let me just take a look and show you what it looks like on Friday morning. Here's where the big difference happens, right? So in this case, I flipped these. I should not have done that. This is the ECMWF now, and this is the GFS. Sorry about that. I did not. This is the GFS. Yeah. So the GFS, notice the trough, which you can see here with the darker colors here, has pretty much connected itself to the hurricane. And that's going to, as it sweeps out, it's not going to push the hurricane right out to the north and east as we might want it to, so it would avoid it all land. But it is going to draw the hurricane far enough north and really kind of not allow it to kind of slip past it. But in the European model, because it's slower, because the trough is a bit faster, the trough has pushed east, and the hurricane is left with some space here in the ridge behind. You can kind of see that in this bubble up in these are called isotherm or isoheights, actually, showing you lines of equal height. And essentially you can see that there's a bit of a ridge, which is basically just a northward jog in the isotherms to the west. And because of that, it allows the hurricane to kind of, with its forward momentum, to kind of head towards that, because it's not being drawn along by the trough. and it would be this next trough that really kind of kicked it out. What's going to protect us? Why I'm not too worried about us under any circumstances, that the hurricane is likely to either get caught by this first trough, or even in this worst case scenario, it's only going to be able to go so far west because the second trough is going to come in and kick it out, right? No matter what happens. And that's going to keep it from taking kind of a real leftward jog like a Sandy, which was such an unusual circumstance. It's not going to do that. No models show that. That would be the only case in which we might see really, really significant impacts here. And there's just no real setup here because this trough is definitely right there. It's there in both models. And this ridge is not big enough and to basically bend it back the way that it would need to in order to give us really significant impacts. So while it's significant, while the impacts are possible, they are still, there is no worst case scenario where we get pummeled. I mean, unless something changes very dramatically. So this has already been quite long, so I want to just switch before we go to patrons. So I did want to just kind of give you the highlights here. We are unlikely to see the worst impacts of Lee. And when I say unlikely, we're very unlikely to see the worst impacts of Lee. We may see nothing more than clouds and breezy conditions. In fact, that's probably even the most likely circumstance at this point. If Lee proceeds more slowly, like we talked about, and therefore takes more of a westward jog there, then we could get some rain and wind. And in that case, we could get enough rain. It would sort of depend on where the rain band's set up, but potentially enough that we'd at least need to be a little bit concerned about some minor flooding issues. And then in that case, we'd also maybe have enough gusty winds to worry about a few scattered power outages. That's sort of the very worst case scenario, I think. Eastern New England, different story, right? The more westward track definitely brings significant winds to eastern Massachusetts, all of the Maine coast, the New Hampshire coast, where we could be talking of winds of 60 to 80 mile an hour with gusts certainly, and lots of rain and flash floods and things like that. Definitely possible, and lots of coastal erosion and coastal flooding as well. So Eastern New England impacts, especially if it takes the western track, more significant. If it takes the more eastern track, then it's more Nova Scotia that's going to worry about that. The coast is almost clear for us, but Lee will need to be monitored just in case things change. All right, that's a long forecast, but there's lots to talk about, and I know that was a little nerdy today, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. I want to give a quick thank you to my patrons. They help support what I do here at the West River Weather Guy and help make it so that I have the equipment and the access to models and things like that I need in order to give you these good forecasts. I will be back probably Thursday morning. Unless something changes dramatically for the worse tomorrow, we'll give it a couple days, and by Thursday we should be real locked in on what's going to happen. Timing on impacts would be Saturday, basically at this point, Saturday evening, even maybe Saturday afternoon to Saturday evening if we have impacts. So that's basically when by Thursday I think we'll be locked in on what's going to happen. So I'll give you the update then. All right. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate your support, and don't forget to follow me on social media and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Make sure you don't miss any of my videos.